The things that you might not like about yourself that we might call violent and unkind are only there because you're violent and unkind to yourself. And so what good is it going to do to add more violence in the hopes of getting rid of your violence? Do you see the invitation to just surrender it all? To just take a breath? Like, whoa, this is getting out of control. Maybe I'm just a mess, and maybe that's okay. There's a beauty to the self-violence. There's a beauty to getting lost. And the answer is not more self-violence. This makes it possible for us to act out in such violent ways towards ourselves and for others. And again, what makes it possible is the misunderstanding of what you are. And each person listening has a wealth of data in their own experience that will confirm this. That you have never been unkind or violent to another without first being unkind and violent to yourself. So naturally, if you want to heal that unkindness and violence towards others, you have to heal the unkindness and violence towards yourself, which is also an invitation to see yourself more clearly, which is, of course, the invitation of spirituality. All right, Valerie says, I like the phrase you just used, self-violent. Starting to dig deep into my pain stemming from false beliefs about myself and its possible reasons. My self-violence has reached a new level. Can you speak more about this war against ourselves so many of us are engaged in, sometimes without even realizing it? And what practices you have found help? Yes, Valerie, I will speak on that. Thank you. Self-violence. My goodness. Well, if we're going to explore self-violence, can we just look at the nature of violence? You know, traditionally, we look at violence as an outward act that causes direct harm to another human being. And of course, this harm can be expressed in 10,000 different ways. And we can also see that there are different degrees to this harm. Whether it's to say something that's unkind, to tear somebody down with our words, to the point of ending someone's experience on this planet. And you see these degrees, right? Speaking ill of someone can be described as violent. Taking someone's life can be described as violence. And everything in between. And I would suggest that it goes even further and more deep than just the things we say about people. And that is in how we see people. Do you see that you can see somebody in a violent way, where you're essentially projecting, let's call it unkindness, where you're projecting violence? And for me, it's important to recognize and honor that in a simple way, violence is violence. Like, I can compare my violence to somebody else's violence and then feel good about my violence because it's not as bad as somebody else's. But that just helps me escape the reality of the violence that's within me. Which is why we so often compare ourselves to help us avoid taking accountability for what's going on inside of us. Well, at least I'm not as bad as that guy. But it's important to be aware that all violence begins in how you see. You can't act out violently without first seeing with violent eyes. That's important to see, because if we're wanting to heal acts of violence, those forms of violence that display themselves on the surface, the invitation is to work backwards towards the root, which is to uncover the ways that we see violently. Because if one is no longer seeing violently, then it's impossible to act out violently. Which is quite beautiful, because when somebody is acting out violently, it's obvious that they're seeing in violent ways, which points toward the confusion, points towards the misunderstanding. And we can address that misunderstanding rather than just trying to control the end result, right? It's very similar to punishing someone for their actions rather than seeking to understand how that action even came to be. And the more you uncover why that action came to be, it makes perfect sense why that action came to be. There was an innocent misunderstanding, which, to go further, we could say wasn't even their fault. So to explore the root of violence, my conclusion on this stems back to the perception of separation. To see yourself as separate from the whole is the beginning of violence. See yourself as separate from life is the beginning of violence. And furthermore, the expressions of outward violence towards others is only possible for the one who is first violent to themselves. So much to say that you cannot be violent to others without first being violent to yourself. And so if there is outward violence, it is a reflection of an inner violence. And it traces itself back to a perception that sees yourself as separate, which is the first violence. And it's fun to explore how, when you see yourself as separate from the whole, how many different ways that can express itself in your self-perception. Like if you look at all of the unkind ways that you see yourself, you can see that that's only possible because you see yourself as separate from the whole, which is to not see yourself clearly, right? It's not to see the truth of what you are. It's to identify with the character that you've created in your mind that is a character that's separate from all the other characters you imagine. And that just comes with a whole host of problems and difficulties. Most notably, to see yourself as separate from the whole implies that you have to struggle to survive, right? Like the whole isn't there to take care of you. Like you're on your own. And that introduces quite a bit of fear. And in that fear, to take care of yourself, you then have to take from others, which again gives rise to that outward violence. This makes it possible for us to act out in such violent ways towards ourselves and for others. And again, what makes it possible is the misunderstanding of what you are. And each person listening has a wealth of data in their own experience that will confirm this, that you have never been unkind or violent to another without first being unkind and violent to yourself. So naturally, if you want to heal that unkindness and violence towards others, you have to heal the unkindness and violence towards yourself, which is also an invitation to see yourself more clearly, which is, of course, the invitation of spirituality. How does this contribute to the war that we often experience? A war of self-violence? Well, it's a perpetual cycle that feeds itself. Maybe to express it in a way that says you're trying to fix self-violence with more self-violence. And I actually recently wrote about this, but a great illustration is like in our effort to change or become better, or even sometimes to improve, we are essentially looking at ourselves as we are now, and we're saying that you're not enough, that I don't love you, and if only you were different, then I would love you. Now, as helpful as that might seem, right? Like, clearly I don't like myself. So, dear self, if you change, then I will like you. Can you see the violence in that? It's looking at yourself with violence and then holding a future version of yourself in the mind that holds your current self hostage. And how's that going? I play that game too. It's not fun. And this sets somewhat of a war against ourselves that says, when you change, when you become different, when you look like this, when you can do that, then I'll love you. You see, it also speaks to the battle taking place with the ego. The ego, which is your perceived separate self, is trying to be whole and complete. But it's trying to be whole and complete independent of the wholeness of life. This is to say, in some way, using silly words, that the ego is trying to be God rather than letting God be God. And so it's trying to complete its image of itself in the world by having this, that, and the other. And it says, once you get there, then I'll love you. However, what you find out is there is no there. Because once you seemingly get there, you find that there's more. It's like you say, okay, when you can do this, I'll love you. And then you're able to do that. And you say, never mind, I mean this. I thought it was that, but it's not that. And so we got to go chase something else now. You see, the ego has its fixation where it thinks, oh, if only I look like this and not that, if only I had this much money, if only my parents approved of me, if only someone loved me, if only XYZ, then I could be whole and complete. But what the ego doesn't realize is that that's just all imagination. There's no reality to that. It's just story after story. Which is kind of funny because the ego is looking to be real, but it's looking in the imagination. It's not even looking in what's real. The ego doesn't want to look at what's real because then the ego will see that it's not real. And the ego will be invited / gently forced to give up its own illusionary self-importance. And so the alternate approach here, the more gentle approach, I guess, in a fast forward kind of way, is to love yourself as you are, which is to put an end to the self-violence and just let yourself be as you are right now. And maybe see the beauty in how you are right now, even in your adorable humanness that gets lost and confused. Maybe that's just part of it. Because again, here's the profound pointer. The things that you might not like about yourself that we might call violent and unkind are only there because you're violent and unkind to yourself. And so what good is it going to do to add more violence in the hopes of getting rid of your violence? Do you see the invitation to just surrender it all? Right? To just take a breath. Like, whoa, this is getting out of control. Maybe I'm just a mess, and maybe that's okay. There's a real beauty to it. There's a beauty to the self-violence. There's a beauty to getting lost. And the answer is not more self-violence. You know what this reminds me of? It reminds me of that classic Jesus quote that in some effect says, if you do not let out what is within you, then what is within you will destroy you. And if you do let out what is within you, then what is within you will save you. And what this is speaking to, from my perspective, is that the more you just allow yourself to be, which is only possible with honoring and loving yourself, then the less harm that will cause, which results maybe in what we can say a better life. And if you don't let out what is within you, then it builds up and it builds up and it explodes out of you. It's like it's coming out sooner or later, which is to really embrace the human experience and everything that comes with it. And this is such an important point because there can be such a tendency to want to pretend to be spiritual and not just let the human be the human. Like in our spiritual exploration, we can create all of these expectations of how we should be, when that's not the point. The point of the spiritual inquiry is to see more of what's true, which is also like saying to see with less judgment, which only allows what is to be what is. The spiritual foundation of all is well, if recognized, would result in a relaxation that just allows yourself to be. And that's where the healing emerges, when we can just allow ourselves to be. But it's scary for the ego because then the ego has to give up control in an effort to get what it wants, right? If the ego has its idea that says, oh, if only you were like ABC, then I can love you. And what spirituality is saying, I love you now. And that's scary for the ego because the ego says, no, you can't love me yet. I'm not there. I haven't reached that version. I don't look like this or that. So you can't love me yet. And life just says, well, I love you now. I don't care if you're like this or like that. I just love you now. Because life, or we could say God, recognizes that the only way that you're going to realistically improve, which is a further embodiment of expressing more love, only comes by way of seeing the love that you are now. And so there's the invitation to surrender the expectation for who you think you should be and stop beating yourself up with it and just love yourself now and then let yourself flow into that expression if that's what's meant to be. But again, this is damn near impossible to do if you're convinced that there's a more lovable version of you, which again is to say that you don't see yourself clearly right now. Because if you saw yourself clearly right now, in the same way that if you saw life clearly, you'd fall in love with life. When you see the immensity of life's beauty, the interconnectedness of all things, the depth and delight of the miracle we're swimming in, you fall in love with it, regardless of the chaos and the noise, regardless of trees falling over. It just has to be that way in order for the miracle to be the miracle. And the miracle is so extraordinary and divine. that when you see the whole thing, you say, my God, you're beautiful. And it's the same thing when you see the truth of what you are. You know what this reminds me of? This reminds me of that woman in my life that I love so deeply. It's like in all of her silliness and all of her beautiful, raw humanness that she might be embarrassed about or she might be insecure about. To me, it's just the most adorable thing. Right? It's like, I don't want her to be this photoshopped image of something. I want her to be her. And when I see the wholeness of her, like seeing the wholeness of life, it's the most beautiful thing. And so you fall in love with it as it is, not as I want it to be to satisfy some egoic desire that I have. No, because to see the wholeness of what it is, you can't help but say, my God, you're beautiful. And it's the same thing with the relationship with ourselves. We're on a journey of seeing ourselves more clearly, which is also a journey of putting a gentle end to the self-violence. And I understand that it can be complicated. It can be confusing. It can seem intense. I get all that, and I'm not saying that it shouldn't be. It's just part of it. In one way, it's like you came here to this dimensional experience to forget yourself so that you could go on a journey of rediscovering yourself. And so everything in between is fine. It's part of the process. And it's not going to be a straight line. It's going to be a wild ride. That is for sure.